Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being with us for this session number 12 of the Rencontre économique d'Aix. Housing, avoiding that the roof falls on our heads or the walls cave in on us. So we'll talk about what should be our refuge. Nevertheless, rentals, housing is very rare, especially for the new constructions in an unprecedented crisis. And there's also the problem of obligations created by the energy rehabilitation rules, which are, of course, really being discussed now with the heat wave we're having. So housing is a social crisis, ecological crisis, and a crisis of public power. So how can we face this? What can we put in place to change things? I'll introduce our guest, Anna Abrunosa. Good afternoon. You're the mayor of Coimbra, former minister of territorial cohesion in Portugal, very directly confronted to the difficulties of the urban environment in floodable areas. There's the president of Airbnb, Clément Eulery, Emmanuel Grégoire, mayor of Paris, who manages one of the highest tense territory in France, Erwan Dupuis, Evoriel, an actor of the reversibility of uses, of land use, Nicolas Joly, Director General of ICADE. You're a promoter and a land developer, and especially for office buildings in different regions of the territory. Thank you for being with us today. So our witness is economist Alain Tranois will coordinate this session with me. So in a few minutes, Alain Tranois, where do we stand with the housing crisis in France, and which territories are found the greatest shortages? What are the problems with urban density, ecological constraints, and what are the leeways? What are the possibilities to change things? Thank you, Gaëtan. Good afternoon, everybody. So this paradox in France is that according to the topics that we discuss, we think that we're the best in the world. We often said, yes, the health system in France is the best in the world. Everybody envies us for that. On other topics, we say, no, we're really the worst student in the class. There's a paradox, but sometimes we have a complex superiority, sometimes inferiority. But for housing, we could, if we just look at France, it's a big housing problem. We could think it's a French problem. No, it's a European problem, even global problem. I would say that France is in a better position than other countries, especially on two standpoints. On the one hand, France built a lot in a certain period. During several years, right until 2019, in fact, France was building more than Great Britain and Germany together. On the other hand, France did not make the mistake other countries did, and in particular Germany and the United Kingdom. They didn't destroy their social park. We have the largest social park that is part of the redistribution in France. That's not why things are going well in France. I think we can explain why things are not that good in France is the price of real estate. The value of the urban land has increased a lot in the last 30 years, and it's an economic phenomenon that's not French, not specific to France, due to the fact that France became richer after being poorer for the first part of the 20th century. So France became richer. They invested part of its savings in housing, in real estate. But there's another reason or origin. Is it structural? We don't know. But the private part that exists on top of the social part to provide homes to the leasers, well, we are witnessing a loss of owners, renters, for different reasons that we can analyze later. This crisis, of course, impacts the youth in the densely populated areas, because there are other regions where there are no problems because territories have no pressure. they don't have the same demographic pressure. One of the difficulties of the housing sector is that it's quite a technical topic. The devil hides in the details. And the second difficulty is that involves a lot of actors: the state, local authorities, the banks, the banking system for financing. It involves the promoters, the land developers, the private owners, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of actors that don't have the same interests. And this means that for the politics, it's a very complicated topic. There are conflicts of interest, the price of housing through environmental policies. For example, is it possible to densify the city for a city that's as dense as Paris and having some green zones, green areas in the cities? There are conflicts that are difficult to prioritize for the public policies. And there's also another issue, another difficulty that comes from the fact that sometimes we confuse the objective and the means. In economy, we distinguish the goals and the means. The means are there to reach a given objective or purpose or goal. But sometimes political consensus are oriented toward means. For example, the restriction of rents, the limiting of rents, for example. I think that this roundtable can be useful by trying to set a diagnosis and answer the question: are we in a crisis that comes from the market and public policies? Often we hear that there could be a failure of the market, a failure of public policies. Is it a failure of the couple? Because we need to get along. And I think the usefulness of this debate is to have a sort of like an overview, to do an overview, and so that we all go in the same direction. So, Alain, I turn to you. Ana Abonoza, is there the same crisis in Portugal, or is this limited to major cities like Lisboa or Coimbra, or does that affect cities like Coimbra, medium-sized?
The housing problem is everywhere in Europe, in Portugal, even in medium cities like Coimbra. And we are facing it building affordable houses. So what we have public lands, we make public-private partnerships, and we use the land to put the prices down. And we are also densifying our city, because we have to build where we have infrastructure, so creating city where we have mobility, where we have services, and this obliges us to have more affordable houses. And we have support from our government. We have 100% of support if we build affordable houses, but this means houses with quality, but lower prices. And it is very important because I don't know if you know, Coimbra has one of the oldest universities of Europe, and we have thousands and thousands of students, but because of the prices of the houses, they don't stay. And we should build houses for young couples and middle classes too.
Est-ce que vous diriez qu'il existe une bonne...
Would you say that there's a good collaboration in Portugal between the public authorities and the state, the municipalities, and the private sector on housing?
Sorry, the hot is making me speaking in French and English. In Portugal, we have several models that we can use, legally use. The housing is a competence of the municipalities, but we have help from our government. And the laws that we have are very, very good. The problem is not the law or the relationship between the government. In Coimbra, I have a big problem because Coimbra is a 2000 old city, so downtown and uptown are degraded, and in many parts I have houses without conditions. So I'm talking with the owners, and I'm classifying the houses as abandoned, and I'm also using the law to make sales that they don't want to do, but the law allows me to sell the houses in a public market if they don't sell an abandoned houses. And this is creating a school, because if I do this in a street, in 2 or 3 houses, then the owners will be more available to sell the houses. They don't do the building, they don't care they don't take care of the houses, they don't want to sell, and then the municipality has to go and has to demand the owners to do the building. They don't do it, and then we take care of the houses and we sell the houses.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la maire. Je me tourne à...
Thank you, Mrs. Mayor. I turn to you, Emmanuel Grégoire. In Paris, Mr. Mayor, the shortage is really a problem. Real estate is rare. You have to build more densely. And on the other hand, there are the environment requirements. You know, there's industrial brown land where Paris decided to build greener but less dense. So how do you arbitrate between that, the number of houses, the housing you provide, and the ecological quality? Well, first of all, to go back on some of the essential challenges that you raised that were mentioned in the introduction. First of all, there's the attractiveness related to the imbalance between offer and demand. It applies, it's true anywhere in the world. Second thing is that obviously the availability, real estate land availability, the fact that you go to transformation, urbanization, there's no longer any brown land. There's some places in the near Porte la Villette or Brunzeau, very little land available, but it's really minimal. I mean, I don't know which brown land you were talking about in the northeast, but I think it's close to the canal. I like the land developers. Yeah, go on paris.fr and you'll find all the information. It's a good example. We tried to work on the parent tension. If you do arbitration on a case-by-case basis, it's complicated. Why? Because in the urban regulations, there are the rules that you set. We did that in the bioclimatic new rules, but there's also acceptancy. What you have in mind is that a challenge with densification. I fight for densification because, contrary to what is said, densification is virtuous. You know, the more you densify the city, the more you reduce your footprint. Except by, you can't have the people disappear. If they're not side by side, they're a bit, then you just spread them. And all studies converge to show that the footprint, the environmental footprint is better when you densify. But there's the first effect of the densification. And you have to be careful not to have an over-densification that leads to counterproductive results. And these rules, we set them in the bioclimatic urban planning, in which you articulate the need to increase the offer of housing and the environmental challenges. In Paris, it's very complicated. There's the question of heritage, the heritage and cultural heritage, and inside that is not only density, but the problem of energy performance of the buildings. In old buildings that will involve heavy investments. So I think we've found a solution to this. I always repeat that Paris would take its share in an attempt to work on offer and demand and try to reduce the gap. But there's no room. We don't have any land available, and there are also the environmental criteria that are a little bit technical. I recognize a lot of people in this room that know that by heart, but protection, the air circulation, the question of protecting the development of green areas. For example, we have 300 hectares that will be developed with the freeing of the land from concrete, to make ensure the pervasiveness of the land. Because the compactness of the city is a major stake to limit our environmental footprint. And the Parisian model has historical values that we owe to Haussmann and to the policies that we are adopting today on the sobriety, the land use efficiency. And again, and the message I have for the real estate actors who've heard me say this before, when people fight against mayors, accusing them of being concrete mayors, lay concrete everywhere. Well, you see that in the city. It's the biggest insult to science and to environmental stakes. And it's what I call the convergence of social conservatism and environmental conservatism. And if you put these people in the same room, nothing will move. And it will be a step back. So we have to fight to go back to building mayors. For decades, a building mayor, we called them the building mayors. It was great, and we praised them for that. Today, they are locked up in the mayors of concrete. But scientifically speaking, societally speaking, it's heresy when you consider history and the challenges we're faced with housing.
In the large towns, we have more and more occasional occupancy, secondary residences. In Paris, it seems, according to the survey, we would go to 10% to 20% of non-occupied housing all year long, with Airbnb and so on. How do you see your situation? Are you an amplifier of tension in terms of offering, or are you also a tool to help families earn some more money because they are suffering? I think we help people earn money. 50% of people have already traveled with Airbnb, and we are in 9,000 communes in France, so it's actually amplified. You were talking about an earning amplifier, you're right. There was a recent tool where they saw the 800,000 others, and they explained why they did it and how. You have Joël, who would actually rent out a few bedrooms when the children went away to university. One would keep the main residence thanks to touristic renting. One would start as a concierge, and you have Antoine, who would have bought 6-7 properties, renting them out. Actually, the spectrum is very wide, but there's one common point that Laurent Cassis has seen and has put under the limelight. It's actually middle class. And they consider, he's heard it so many times, that they don't earn enough with work. And so there's a complement of purchasing power, which is necessary to pay charges, to pay works, to go off on holiday. We talk about 4,300 euros a year, and it's a lot of money. So renting out for short term can actually make sure that you earn more money, that's for sure. But it's also at the heart of a lot of debate. I can understand that it sparks a debate. We have to put back this debate into reality. Now, 9 dwellings out of 10, 92% of dwellings are being rented occasionally on Airbnb, because we're talking about the main residence. It has no impact on housing. It rather has a positive impact on purchasing power. The shops benefit from it. There's also a travel tax that we have to pay. But also in the main cities, you can have another problem. So in Le Marais, in Annecy, they didn't wait for Airbnb types of rentals to happen before they would become attractive. But the lack of balance between the offer of touristic dwellings and the supply, well, we have to understand the complexity, because we have to understand the levers for the elected, the local elected to understand that. But how can we actually boost the housing offer? What I want to say is that in such districts like that, we have to target and make sure that the local investors want to invest for the long term rather than for the short term. For short-term rental, let's benefit from it. When we talk about the 8%, this 80,000, we're not going to solve the housing crisis with these dwellings, but it's better if they are rented out for long term, so we can have quotas in the districts, in the neighborhoods, so that we have a proportion of actions in these neighborhoods to make sure that these people that own property want to rent out for the long term. When land is more seldom and more expensive, what are the solutions for land developers to find some housing, to offer housing in places where there's not a lot of housing available? We were talking about brown land. You're saying there's no longer brown land. What can we do? Well, to follow up on what was said, we produced 270,000 dwellings in 2025. That's the lowest in 20 years. And we have 2.8 million people waiting for affordable housing. So we have a supply-demand crisis. And we, as operators of the segment, I would like to talk about this. We have a social crisis, the housing crisis, the purchasing power crisis for the young ones. We also have a crisis in the industry. I would like to talk about it as an operator and land developer. The city industry is more than 10% of GDP. We've lost 1% in 1 year. We have destroyed 17,000 jobs. And so we have to address the issue. How should we react? We have a short-term solution. How can we stimulate the offer, the production? And the question of the sites we can work on is indeed a question. When we talk about sites, it is fundamental for our industry. We have to reinvent ourselves. Without being a transformation industry, we're not a production industry. New build is no longer the case, but if we have to project by 2015, 80% is already in existence. So we need new skills, new balances, a new playing field. The sites are indeed available. I'm talking as the chairman of the Observatory of Real Estate in Ile-de-France. You have 6 million of working premises that are vacant. You also, when we talk about affordable housing, we need mapping, because we have identified 80,000 hectares of land that we could use. So if we can push forward with all this scenario, we could actually put 1.6 million housing. We have to do it, but it's different, and we have to do it. And I think that's what our main concern, the main issue that we have to address. And then we have to think about how to embark upon this transformation to address these important societal stakes for the environment, for the youth. It's not a transitional crisis. It's not just an overnight shock. It's actually a deep transformation we have to undergo. And that is linked also to the land use, because we'll have movements of demographics. This is related to a different age pyramid. We'll re-industrialize the land, and we have to take this on board, and we have to work in collaboration with elected representatives. We have a 5-year window that is opening up until 2032, and we can work with a single scale, and we have to work on this now. And how about you? You're looking at the production of dwelling in high intensity and high density areas. What do we ask from you? Do you have viable projects for real estate, or do you have to deal with constraints that are just overwhelming and that cannot be addressed? I don't see why environment and housing should be pitted against, because this should be reconcilable. We have a deep crisis, a silent crisis that impacts natality, that impacts employment everywhere in the country. And this social crisis is translated in a housing tension that is very strong, especially in high density areas. I was working with real estate agencies, our friend, and we had 102 dwellings that were available for rental. And in Aix, we have 67. So that shows you the disproportion. And this is why we have housing shortage. Everything for the students, for example, all the student housings were already taken at the beginning of the summer for the next year. That means that we need new housing. There's a demographic and social pressure. People live on their own more, and we have seniors with a longer life expectancy, so we have more needs. But there's also another problem, is we have a production dip. The new build program has been divided by 2, and we see it in our figures. And I think that we should not have this offer dip pitted against the environment, because we're talking about real estate that is already in existence. And this is where the problem lies. This is real estate that already exists when we have to talk about the environment. We have stopped a lot of new build for detaxation problems, but we shouldn't say that actually the environment problem is related to 80% of the housing stock. They need contributions for them, because we have a problem with the voting rights, because a lot of them are not in favor of investing in new projects. We can simplify also everything, and if we want to have subsidies because we need them, we have to relaunch the subsidy program. But could we prompt the landowners to sell this real estate when it's vacant? What about the right of the tenants? Doesn't it discourage the landowners to rent out their property because the tenants have too many rights maybe today? Well, I would like to talk about this, because we talk about multi-property owners and so on that have so much money. They have decided to use savings to house people. They decided to undergo debt for 25 years to have a 600 euro rent for these real estate properties that they own. And we should thank them, actually, because they have a lot of risk. The risk of buying the property and having a loan. The risk of finding a tenant to rent their property. And they have all these risks just to have 2,000 euros of tax credit per year. And we know that there are actually other programs that could be very much more beneficial. And they account for a large share of the housing stock today. And it's a domino effect, because the problem is that these landowners have too many constraints today. And it's scary. And the investors that we need, we have also the permit to rent. That's a lot of constraints as well. And I think the status of the private landowner, that was the framework to allow this type of investment, is today not sufficiently relevant and doesn't prompt enough confidence so that we can solve this crisis. Thank you. In your note, you were talking about 2 different types of sites. You were talking about occasional and the reversibility of working premises into housing, even if it costs more to build. Can you specify the size of these premises that we could convert into dwellings? I'm going to take the example of Paris, and I'm going to make a comparison with Marseille. It's not to compare what was the state of play or the results of the municipal elections. It's the INSEE report issued in 2023. There was actually this trend, in Paris, there was 10% of vacant housing. Now we stand at 20%. When we compare between 2017 and 2023, 7 years have elapsed, and we can see that there's more housing in Paris, more than 1 8.4 million. More housing available, 20,000, but as main residence, we had less 16,000. So there was an increase of vacant housing and an increase of secondary residences. And from a housing policy, this cannot be considered as satisfactory. And it's a recent development that is actually deepening a crisis that is already in existence. Marseille is the second main city of France. Same figures, you have an increase of housing. There was an increase of only 3,000 dwellings for secondary residents and no increase of vacant housing. I'm not saying that the management is better, but the market conditions are different, the offer is different, the demand is different. But in my opinion, there's a real concern. And there's something that is specific to Île-de-France. There's 6 million square meters of working premises that are unoccupied. And they're considered as outdated because there has been an evolution in business work premises so far. So what does it account for? The size of a dwelling in the private sector is 63 square meter, in the other is 60. So we can do a division that can be very easy, and that means that we could create, if we want to transform, we could create 100,000 additional dwellings, 1,500 euro per square meter. So for 66 square meters, we have to invest 100,000 euros. So if we manage to buy the square footage of working premises and we manage to create dwellings and we rent it at 600 euros per month, it's 9 euros per square meter, so it's exactly the average price. We have a return rate of 7%. So that means that if we manage to buy at a discount price these premises that are worthless now, we can find an exit strategy that is actually valuable. Well, give me your work premises that are worthless now and I'll do something about it. I would like to talk about touristic residents. We went from 10 to 20% in a decade. That means that we have a theoretical reservoir. How can we sell this real estate stock? It is a priority indeed. We talked about the discrepancy between supply and demand, but there's another subject which is important, is the shrinkage of the housing stock. It is an issue for two reasons. First, because there's an imbalance between the supply and demand, and it worsens it. And secondly, this contraction is due to the private renting sector. And to make things short, if there's a housing crisis of the rental segment, it's because it's not profitable and nobody wants to invest in it. And the sector is very smart in this diversity to try to find all the reasons to find real estate products that are more profitable at times where you can have changes that could be profitable. First, we talked about furnished housing for touristic purposes. I'm not a racist versus Airbnb. You can eat at a high price nearby, but it has a symbol. I have nothing against Airbnb and touristic types of dwellings, but if people rent 2-3 months a year to get some money, it's not a problem. It's just more money for them, and all the better. And it's not a crisis that would be propelled by this. But as for the rest, it's so profitable that for years all the private investment was mainly geared towards this. We had to find some locks, and there's a small nuance that I would like to bring, because the small private investor that is using savings by working so hard, that's not the reality. There are a few of them. Yes, of course, there's a few of them. We're not going to talk about exceptions. We're going to try to analyze the mainstream. Most of the properties are being owned by landowners that have more than 5 properties, and it's one of the best investments in the world, not because of the rental return, but because of the evolution of the price per square meters. You rent or not, it doesn't make a difference. We talked about the inherent risk because you have the problems with tenants that do not pay the rent. So it's even better not to have any tenants at all. Because what is of interest, well, there are normative tools. We can create safeguards to avoid the negative impact of this. We can try to make sure that it is more interesting from a financial point of view. And for this, if we manage to get it more interesting, then investors will come back. Maybe we'll need to have tax credits being afforded and granted. When I talk about professional premises, I'm not talking about the one-off rentals. Of course, we have 25% of the housing stock in Paris of dwellings which is circumvented and geared towards touristic finalities and purposes. And there's a problem of lack of knowledge because the Ministry of Finance doesn't agree with the figures that are being published. Today we have a boom of secondary residences and touristic housing, but for tax optimization purposes, the Ministry of Finance, they say that there's a boom of main residences because there's an optimization of domiciliation to circumvent the intercommunality rules that would not authorize to rent in some areas, and we have observed this. So the state doesn't understand anything, and it's difficult to find because we don't have all the breakdown in terms of tax levies. So what about the housing stock, and how can we partake in fostering the supply of housing stock? Well, touristic dwellings did help to have a better knowledge of fraudulent uses, because there are people that would say that they rent in the limit of 80 days, but they do more. They rent it for a longer period of time. We have to regulate secondary residence, which is a phenomenon which is worsening. And it's actually also the backside of the story, because they all want to have a small property in Paris. But when you look at the detailed report, the report of Apuri is quite telling. I had a vision of secondary residence whereby it would be the Americans, the Germans, Russians, Chinese wanting to have a 4-bedroom apartment in Paris. No, actually, it's people from Ile-de-France. They just wanted to keep small properties, and they don't want to sell them because they don't need it for financial purposes. It is fully amortized and depreciated, and they might think of a use for their children, their grandchildren later. There's no liquidity on this housing market in Paris again. So the figures are disastrous. And those in the room that might have looked for renting anything, and that happens to any kind of social class in Paris, because one of the phenomena of the fact that you live on your own and you don't live in when you split up, and you need to find your own apartment, even when you have a high salary, you can't find any place to rent because we need a lot of deposits. You need to give your blood and your everything in you to be able to get an apartment. And that shows that the social crisis is transversal. From the popular classes to homeless people to the middle class to the higher classes, they feel that it is unbearable, because even if they earn, they have a good earning, they can't find an apartment. And there are life events which are important for births and so on, and there are also other events like when someone dies. But I think that from a regulatory point of view, we should know how to proceed. When we look at the three, life expectancy, birth rate drop, and the lack of cohabitation in Paris, to try to stabilize all this, I would have to create 8,000 additional dwellings. That's to stabilize the population. And so we need to launch a shock in terms of housing supply everywhere where there's demand, because this is where there's employment actually. And we have to modernize the normative tools, and the law is not the right tool. because by the moment, at the interval between the time when we try to analyze and then we enact a law, 10 years have elapsed. And fighting against frauds, and we have to fight against it with a lot of strength. I have waged battles against frauds and also against civil leases. This is a shame. I don't know if some people do it, but we should actually fight against this because it is a pity. I don't want to reproach to private individuals to invest money, but you can't reproach the civil services to find those that are actually breaching the law. How can we strike the right balance between occasional housing and all year long housing?
Ça dépend du bien, ça dépend du...
Depends on the property. We talked about main residence. There's a question on secondary residence, just temporary residence. We talked about the increase of 10 to 20% of underused housing. When I look at how many we have at Airbnb, it's not Airbnb that does the largest part of this increase. Is it profitable to rent for the long term? And obviously, and that's what I was saying earlier, is that there are some districts in which there's a particular tension where the short-term investments, we have to encourage long-term investments and set some quotas that are targeted and proportionate. Why that? Obviously, to reach a balance between the occasional rentals and the housing of local populations, to enable to continue to withhold the attractiveness, touristic attractiveness. There's 1 point of GDP, and very positive for local shops and things, and beyond that. You have to continue to encourage these occasional rentals for furnished goods. The occasional rental gives the capacity for buying power, for the rehabilitation of housing, for example, but the long-term rental must be encouraged otherwise. But there's this example in Nice you talked about, where the municipality set up the cohabitation of this occasional and long-term rental. So this is part of the toolbox that local representatives, elected representatives, have. So there's this measure that's possible. What is the starting point for that? We all know that there is more flexibility in the use of the housing offer, the mobility workers, the people who are the students who need temporary housing, the divorcing couple, everything, and added to this the demographic evolution, where the households are in smaller numbers. The structure of housing is no longer adapted to the uses. So one of the ways forward, the city of Nice or the Pays Basque urban community, they offer a mixed service to encourage student housing, and that was discussed. We mentioned that often because it's pivotal. So what do we need to do? Allow the students to be able to rent at low rent and to keep their apartment throughout their student years. So they can free the apartment to go back home or whatever, and accept that it's rented. So the mixed lease is a possibility to adapt to the uses and to enable to make a step forward to offer more housing for the students. So Nicolas Joly, transform offices in apartments in large cities, for example. It's a solution. It's more costly, but it doesn't consume as much carbon. It's good for the environment. It's an important aspect here. Is it possible to go faster? What is hindering this development besides the cost? Well, in fact, it's tempting because you have 6 million square meters, in Paris, for example. We have a lot of offices, empty offices, and no housing. So it's very tempting. Is it possible? Yes. Can it be industrialized? Not yet. First of all, there's the financial problem. First of all, the construction cost, which is higher. We transformed office building tower in Lyon, a Framatome head office in 100 social housings. It costs us 30% more than to tear it down and rebuild it. But there's a question of the entry cost, because we have these 6 million unoccupied office buildings. All office buildings are not worthless, So there's a technical topic. So besides the cost, there's the design of your building. So it became ultra specialized with buildings that yield a lot of performance, but they're only for a single use offices. So it's the whole design has to be reviewed. It's not necessarily adapted. It's not a question of cost. It's a question of how you reshape the building. And the third obstacle is political, because if you transform offices, there is an office tax that you pay. Even for vacant offices. But if then you want to create housing, there's no housing tax, so you need to invest in public equipment that are non-existing, for example. And you have what you mentioned is the social acceptability. The density is a solution, and I think we all agree on that. We shouldn't oppose density and environmental aspects, and this makes things complicated. So once you've removed obstacles, then let's think about the possibility. I mentioned Lyon, Bordeaux, we did that, it's possible, but today it's handicrafts, it's not, we don't have an industrial model. It cannot be deployed elsewhere. So in l'Île-de-France there is the issue of the scale, because in this specialization goal, the buildings were really shaped for office use. So how do you reinvent the district, the neighborhood? Because you have the leasers that are the landlords that are separated and everything. So you have to have a vision that's at the scale of the territory, and you have to take into account the environmental aspect. You have in the north of Paris we have 50 hectares of parks, so we transformed office building permits into housing building permits, and this enabled us to integrate the environment aspect. If you have 1.5 hectares, the first thing you do is not to do an urban forest. So you have to work with the elected representatives, with the city councils. So is it a possibility? How can we speed things up? So I think there are a lot of things that were said on the office buildings, office space, but on the regulatory aspects the mayor mentioned. When we say I will regulate the leases and the rents and everything, but what happens is that there are a lot of landlords who use the civil code leases. No, I will pull out of the FLG. These apartments were not destroyed or anything, so we think that we are mastering the market with a lot of regulation, but we're just having the landlord just abandoned. So there are some abuses, but we regulate for 10% excesses, and 90% will just flee. It's not the good solution. So, Mr. Mayor, I fully agree with what you just said, but but the answer is not the same depending on where you are, and the law applies everywhere stupidly. There's no differentiation. You don't regulate the same way in Paris, in the ultra-dense areas, or elsewhere. And what are the common points? There are convergences. That's why we're in the same meetings. Is places where you have a lot of tourist activity, where it's hyper attractive and economically attractive. And Cumana has the same problems of Biarritz, Nice, and Paris, not for the same reasons. And I'm perfectly aware that the regulations is the argument of the weak to regulate the excesses of the market. But in the end, that's what's left. And when investors say we have to stop with these stories of setting a limit to the rents and everything, I know the perverse effects, including But you know, if you don't limit the rents, you don't add a single apartment on the market. It's not enough. And so I think there should be a limit to the rents, but it's not enough. And at the end, on office buildings, how do we tackle the housing crisis in Paris? One, we need to really try to deal with the stock of abandoned office buildings, you know, very complicated financially, tax-wise and everything, but we have to address that. There's 1 million square meters in districts that have all kinds of services already. And the second thing we must say is the question of densification of the urban fabric in the first and second crowns of Paris. We have 30,000 inhabitants per square kilometers, and the average is 8,000. And so there's this question of transforming office space. What do you do in Portugal for that, transforming office building, office space?
Conclusion, because in Coimbra, we are receiving more and more young couples that come from Lisbon and Oporto. We don't have a problem of empty offices. We have the other problem. We need more offices because our option is to rebuild all the part of the city. And many young entrepreneurs, they want to live and work in the same places, having no car, having high quality of life. And you can do only that if you live in a medium city, in the same place. You can have your office, you can have your house, you have culture, and you have you can live without car. I have no car. I live in Coimbra, and I use public transport. So the solution. The problem is that we have big cities without quality of life, and then we should have a more equilibrium in what concerns territorial planning. So we don't have, even in tourism, it was tourism that allows us to rebuild the old part of the cities. But now we have to have an equilibrium. So multifunctional cities, multifunctional with houses, offices, tourism, the equilibrium. And no cars, green spaces, no cars, green spaces, and more green spaces, more and more. You should walk the city, you should live the city. Even in this, if you have green cities, you can have a difference of 5 to 10 Celsius degrees in temperature.
Merci beaucoup, Anna Brunosa. Alain, en 2 minutes, à vous entendre et à entendre les praticiens.
2 minutes. You know, we have the experts here. What are, according to you, the 2 knots that we need to untie, the 2 things we need to tackle in priority? So, knots. What we need to tackle first, the 2 elements we need to tackle.
Cities, because we can't not.
Pardon Anna, vous conclurez tout à l'heure. C'était juste pour.
Conclude later, Anna. I'm sorry, Alain. J'adore Alain. I thought we were reaching the end. Oh yeah, we're at the end. What I was to say, what I understand with this debate. First of all, we talk the same language. There were 2 economists here, because Madame is an economic teacher, professor. There were 6 economists in Paris. We're talking the same language, and as long as we talk the same language, we can find solutions. The second thing, I have a secret for you. I will reveal the secret to you when Clément Eury said that in certain districts we can accept that there will be a more constraining regulation on seasonal rentals. In some districts, you know, adapting to the morphology of the city. The mayor of Paris, Emmanuel Grégoire, whispered to him and said, yes, I agree. That's beautiful, and it shows that we need to work hand in hand to go in the same direction. So just one word to conclude, so each of you first. One thing on which you would want to be judged 5 years from now, what would it be? Anna?
a city with fewer cars. You know, I have a problem with cars. High quality public transport, bringing housing back to the city center for young families and middle class families, and green city, a green city.
Merci,
and
Anna.
a resilient city.
Merci Anna. Monsieur le maire, 1 minute rapide.
Thank you, Anna. Mr. Mayor, that all those who want to live in Paris can. Clément. That Airbnb be seen and do the job and collaborate with local elected representatives to be able to quantify and take measures and release the market, free the market. That with the elected representatives we do urban transformation. We talked about office spaces, we talked about the entrance of the cities and that they be transformed, that the private landlord be recognized for what it does to fight the housing crisis. So you see,